Thank you very much. Thanks for a very kind introduction, Peter, and it's absolutely great to be back again in Belfast, which is a place that has a special spot in my academic heart as well, because it's also, you could say, one of the sites of the International Network of Irish Famine Studies that Peter and I and another colleague actually were co-directors of. It has been running successfully for a couple of years, and that has provided great academic pleasure and some very good publication stuff forthcoming. So it's always a great pleasure to be back, and as Peter was already mentioning to you, today I'm actually going to talk to you about something else. I recently submitted a big funding bid to the Dutch Research Council, NWO, which is actually related to European local qualification, because they always like to see very broad international perspectives if you want to require, well, basically if you're requesting funding. Obviously Ireland is still a very important part of that bigger project that I submitted. And the idea of this project, which also includes Dutch, Flemish, and also German and Irish North American local qualification, amongst others, is to be able to shift paradigms in regionalist studies and to actually talk about regionalist studies as not being connected to the idea of nation building or nationhood, which is what most people have actually been talking about, but to look at the transnational perspectives that you can actually shed on, well, the fiction of the time. And I must say the bigger project I submitted also includes illustrated periodicals as part of two of the sub-projects. So I also tried to make that project transmedial, and I can only hope I will get the funding to realise that ambition. But the sub-project I want to carry out as part of that is definitely on Irish local qualification, with specific focus also on the revival period, because that is already offering quite a lot of material to talk about. That's also what I'm going to talk with you about today. So I would be very grateful for any feedback, since this is work in progress and a new project. Any feedback you have, and I know there are many experts here in the room that are able to shed very important light on things that I have to say. And I would really like to invite you to enter into a dialogue with me afterwards. All right. The concept of the region is currently subject to revival. Folk museums such as the Ulster American Folk Park enjoy immense popularity. New local heritage sites demonstrating rural traditions and folklore, such as the Dow Famine Village in County Donegal, have been developed. Artisan local food as well as language courses in regional dialects are in high demand. And this regained interest in the region, in politics, the media and culture, is often seen as a negative response to often anxieties over immigration, multiculturalism and globalization, identified with ethnostalgia and viewed as a tool employed specifically by right-wing political populism across Europe. To give an example from Ireland, a post on the Stormfront web forum argues in favour of a revival of, and I quote, folk tales and heroic sagas, and states that we need to start farming again in order to get in touch with Irishness as an antidote to the foreign customs and traditions brought in by immigrants. The question is, however, whether the region has been, and is indeed justly interpreted, as culturally and politically retrograde and socially exclusive in terms of cosmopolitanism. In order to answer this question, connected to Europe's current challenges of internal cohesion, solidarity, immigration and multiculturalism, it is vital to investigate how the European region traditionally functioned in relation to transnational cultural frameworks and dynamics. My paper today will focus on Irish regionalism in literature, local qualification, investigating its transnational dimensions as a way to offer alternative perspectives and paradigms. Traditionally, the Irish region and its cultural representations were framed in terms of nationality. The preface to the 1833 edition of William Carleton's collection of regional tales, Traits and Stories of the Irish Peasantry, published by William Wakeman, presents the stories as, I quote, a touching dissertation upon Irish character. It explicitly frames the regional characters that feature in the collected tales as national types, stating that the readers will be acquainted with the condition and character of the peasantry of Ireland, and the darker shades of the Irish character. This preface by the author is symptomatic for the ways in which the Irish region and its literature, local qualification, which records the folklore, the customs, the vernacular and the ways of life of a clearly recognisable region, have conventionally been perceived through the lens of nationalism and nation building. Local colour fiction has generally been analysed in context of nation formation, interpreted as either cultural resistance to the enforcement of national social norms and processes of standardisation on a national or on an imperial level, or viewed as a genre that contributed to the conceptualisation of national identity through crystallisation of regional ways of life that are viewed as representative for national character. The latter certainly holds for presentations and perceptions of Irish local colour fiction, which were often imbued with a sense of a regionalised nationalism. I'm actually quoting Joost Augustijn, my compatriot, in which the local serves as the foundation of cultural national identities. During the 19th and early 20th century, Irish regions, and under the influence of Celtic revivalists, especially those in the West, were interpreted as sites which express an authentic national character from which many Irish had become disconnected through English cultural imperialism. Thus, in the Aran Islands from 1907, John Millington Synge represents the three islands at the mouth of Galway Bay as regions which secrete indigenous, authentic and quintessentially Irish culture. As what could be described, if I may give a variation on the notion of Pierre Nora, le lieu de tradition, wat dan dus lieu de mémoire, Inishmore, Inishman and Inisheer are pictured as local communities where the native population speaks the Gaelic language, cultivates the land, builds dwellings according to traditional methods, converses about the Book of Kells and other ancient manuscripts, this is actually what Synge writes, as well as he says, fairies and the women they have taken, stock elements of Irish identity. While the scholarly recognition of regional literature and culture in connection to issues of imperialism and nationalism is certainly legitimate, so I'm not questioning that in the first place, the hitherto rather insulary approach to Ireland's local colour of the long 19th century has blinded us towards its strong transnational dimensions. In the field of literary studies, little work has been done to map out the regional tale's response to and function within a globalising world. This paper aims to suggest a translocation of Irish regional studies towards a broader European and even transatlantic framework of investigation in this respect, in light of the three following phenomena. First, the role of transnationalism in the form of foreigners or emigrants in Irish local colour narratives. And second, the circulation of the Irish local colour tale in translation across Europe. Analysing text by, amongst others, Jane Barlow, Sean Bullock, who comes from Northern Ireland, as some of you will know, Catherine Tin and Alice Nolan, this paper will address the complexities of intended audience and forms of publication, which I think very important things we have to look at if you want to answer these questions. As Josephine Donovan has observed in her pioneering comparative study of 19th century fictions of the region, it's called European Local Colour Literature, it was published in 2010, European local colour literatures often responded to forces of modernity, exploring the clash between the modern and the pre- or the anti-modern, without overly romanticising or mystifying rural life. Donovan is certainly right in thus interpreting the narrative templates of conflict that underlie regional works of fiction, and her argument also applies to Irish local colour narratives. However, as I want to argue today, the dynamics of Irish local colour literature are more complex in that it frequently represents regional cultures and communities that do not just clash with or engage with issues of nationalisation or colonisation, but are additionally subject to transnational influences and interactions. The long 19th century was marked by several types of emigration, as you probably all know, most notably to North America during and in the wake of the Great Famine. But also in the 1890s, when 4 out of 10 persons born in Ireland still decided to settle in other countries. This engagement of the Irish with transnational societies through emigration is reflected by regional stories that, though set in a specific rural region, depict strong, mutually effective and reconfigurative connections between the region and Ireland's diaspora. These local colour tales often explicitly deal with the effects of emigration on the region, in the form of depopulated communities, ruptured families, alienation and conflict, as well as the impact of the foreign on regional life. County Roscommon writer Charlotte O'Connor Eccles's story Tumavara from her collection Aliens of the West, published in 1904, suggests that age-old communities have been broken up by the pressures of emigration. The local rural community has been transformed beyond recognition by the call from beyond the Atlantic. The description of Tumavara conjures up a landscape of ruined cabins and farms where the townspeople graze their cows, on which the foundations of whole villages may be traced, covered deep in weeds and herbage. Because so many people have, as we can read, gone to America, as the narrator intimates, it is possible to drive for miles in many directions without finding an inhabited house, and at harvest time the farmers grumble at the scarcity of labourers. The fact that the region has become infused with transnational impacts due to continuous emigration flows has turned into a deserted place that is no longer bustling with agricultural activity and life. The story can thus be perceived almost as a regional elegy, in that the ways in which interaction with transnational territories through emigration has changed the region are lamented. The narrative evokes the image of an old man who is actually running alongside the train as it steams out till he drops exhausted, great tears streaming down his cheeks. The tears shed by the old man imply the melancholy of those staying behind in a deserted local community. And at the other side of the ocean, we can read, those who left the home country are overwrought with emotions, homesickness for the native locality. The haunting beauty of the sun on their homestead is a memory that lingers on in the minds of those who were born amidst it, as we can read, and that in Manchester slums or the backblocks of New York fills the old folks with sick longing for home. Thus traditionally identifying transatlantic emigration with exile, Tumavara as a story at the same time shows that the region affects the transnational in the form of haunting memories that trigger feelings of displacement and a desire that we can call a reflective nostalgia, and I derived the term from Svetlana Boym's very influential work on nostalgia here. Eggers' story at the same time suggests interaction between the regional and the transnational by showing how the community that is paralysed by a resistance to reform thinks that what was good enough for our fathers is good enough for us, and that also in this sense makes it a place that is frowned upon by returning emigrants. We can actually read the following in the text. To the returned emigrants, the place seems woeful, the embodiment of poverty, desolation and decay. But those who live here and have always lived here do not notice this. Custom counts for a great deal, and we cannot see with their eyes. The narrator's subsequent attempts to explain the living conditions and the sanitary conditions of the community clearly seem to be directed to a non-initiated audience elsewhere, in the same way that she evokes this outsider's perspective on the region through the remigrant. The narrative lens to which the region is presented is therefore also partially transnational. The regional and transnational are two worlds that come together as well as collide in George Moore's tale Homesickness from his famous work The Untilled Field, also from 1904. The narrative focuses on returning American immigrant James Bryden, who, due to failing health, goes back to his native village after 13 years living in New York's Bowery. Like many immigrants who, as Andreas Husen claims, tend to create a unified or even mythic memory of the lost homeland, Bryden clings to a crystallized mnemonic image of his homeland, and we can actually read the following. As he sat in the railway carriage, he recalled his native village. He could see it and its lake, and then the fields one by one, and the roads. He could see a large piece of rocky land, some 300 or 400 acres of handland, stretching out into the winding lake. And as he alights, initially nothing seems to have changed, for it is, as we can read, just the same blue limestone station house as it was 13 years ago. The platform and the sheds were the same, and there were 5 miles of road from the station to Duncannon. There are fewer people around, however, than previously, so emigration has impacted the village environment, and overall things are in worse repair than he ever saw. The story thus reveals that the regional and its ways of life cannot be seen as detached from transnational developments. Initially, Bryden seems to take to his native community, relishing the milk, the bacon and the cabbage in the pot and the comfort of sitting by the mild peat fire. But he is soon irritated by the passivity of the villagers, who complain about the poverty in which they are stuck, and feels no interest in the fact that O'Connor had lost a mare and foal worth £40. He actually wishes himself back in the slum, we can actually read. The way in which the villagers are cowed by the priest who forbids lovemaking and dances eventually actually turns him off, we can read. But the obedience of these people to their priest surprised him. When he was a lad, they had not been so obedient, or he had forgotten their obedience. and he listened in mixed anger and wonderment to the priest who was scolding his parishioners, speaking to them by name, saying that he had heard there was dancing going on in their homes. Their submission was pathetic. It was a submission of a primitive people clinging to religious authority, and Bryden contrasted the weakness and incompetence of the people about him with the modern restlessness and cold energy of the people he had left behind him. When a letter from a colleague who works at his bar in New York reaches him, Bryden feels homesick for his adoptive country. We can read, the smell of the Bowery slum had come across the Atlantic and had found him out in his western headland. Ireland is no longer the place where Bryden belongs, and we can read, when the tall skyscrapers stuck up beyond the harbour, he felt the thrill of home that he had not found in his native village, and he wondered how it was that the smell of the bars seemed more natural than the smell of the fields, and that the roar of crowds seemed more welcome than the silence of the lake's edge. Life in New York has transformed Bryden so much that he can no longer feel at home in his native region, and can no longer settle back as he had initially intended. The narrative just stages the conflict between the region and the cosmopolitan, and I'm very much, I think, in favour of the cosmopolitan this time, as you can see. While the story criticises rural local Ireland for the way in which it persistently holds on to old-fashioned hierarchies, at the same time the tale is ambivalent about the attraction of the region in the globalising world. For as an old and lonely man, we read, Bryden indulges in reminiscences of the landscape, desiring, as this text says, to be buried in the village where he was born. The things he saw most clearly were the green hillside and the Bog Lake and the rushes about it and the greater lake in the distance, and behind it the blue lines of wandering hills. Bryden seems to have a hyphenated identity, a split and double existence stretched across the multiple ruptures between here and there. And the unchanged image of his native region is as much static, albeit also comforting, as the local community is in all its inflexibility and set ways. So in Bryden, nostalgia for the regional and desire for the transatlantic world, they clash and interact continuously, and cannot be seen as separate from one another at all. While the theme of emigration and its effects on the region are prevalent in local colour fiction from the 19th and early 20th century, figures such as transnational travellers and returning emigrants feature prominently too. One example is a story called His Magnificence by County Fermanagh author Sean Bullock. Maybe some of you will have heard of him. And it's a story from his collection called Ring of Rushes, which was published in 1896. The story depicts a returning emigrant by the name of Thomas Burke, who has risen in status after settling in America. Thomas's watch chain rings and clothes, and his grand entree by train with powerful luggage that gives him the appearance of a prince make a great impression upon the villagers, who still remember him as little Tommy, who in rags and tatters had walked turf from door to door through the very street. His prolonged stay in America has greatly changed Thomas, however, and he now looks down upon the village of his childhood in a very condescending manner. Feeling himself too good for Gortine, we can read that His Magnificence deliberately strolls through the village and flaunts his success in order to extract admiration that he believes that he is entitled to. We can read, he reckoned upon making an impression. It was his due. Presenting an outsider perspective on the village, Thomas only sees its squalor and backwardness. He even feels out of place in his old mother's cottage, and is disgusted by its smoky atmosphere and the food that his mother serves him. While Tommy's acquired wealth alienates him from the village, which is well illustrated by the fact that he announces himself as a stranger when he enters his mother's cabin, he also takes issue with the simple rural daily routines that have not changed at all since he departed. Offended by its anti-modern way of life, which included bogs and naked, wretched houses, Thomas sighs, and he actually says in himself, no enterprise, no capital, not anything, just the same as when he had left it, just the very same. While the village with its main lane, the fields and the house before him were just as they had ever been, and just as they would ever remain, Thomas is so much changed that the villagers at first did not recognise him. And ironically, Ned Noble suggests that the village had gone through many powerful changes since Thomas's emigration, as people had died, had married, or had changed farm. There is a clash between the perceptions and transformations of the Gauthian population on the one hand, and Thomas's on the other. And incompatible dynamics of change that they register suggest that there is a contrast between the static nature of the local community and the dynamic urban existence in America. The region is invaded by the transnational and clashes with it. As such, the story demonstrates the concern with transnationalism that many scholars of Irish local folklore fiction have often overlooked, and I think that actually is a topic we need to investigate much more in relation to a much larger corpus. Now for the second strand of my talk, transnational circulation. The discussed stories suggest the urgency to examine Irish local colour fiction from transnational perspectives in the form of templates, themes and narrative focalisation. And if I speak about narrative focalisation, I'm thinking of Thomas in Bullock's story and Dryden in Morse Tale. We really see everything through their eyes. They are basically the subject of focalisation all the time. And there is an omniscient narrative voice present as well that sometimes interferes with those moments of focalisation, and I think it's very interesting dynamics going on there. But we, as readers, are sort of really led by the perspectives of the main characters here. Now, there is an additional aspect of Irish local colour fiction that calls for such a transnational lens than this one. It's trans-European and transatlantic circulation. Irish local colour novels and short stories would be reprinted in magazines or in editions elsewhere in Europe, often after translation, and in North America as well. As such, these texts not only reached transnational audiences, but they were even explicitly marketed as literature for reading communities beyond the region, beyond the nation or empire, and across the globe. Timothy Baycroft, Judith Batterley, Marjorie Price and Stephanie Ford have pointed to the role of local colour fiction in the construction of national identities, connecting bourgeois readers in urban centres with the popular traditions of underdeveloped regions of the nation or empire that was sometimes politically marginalised, by making readers from different imagined communities aware of and able to identify with people from other regions. These narratives endeavoured to promote national cohesion. At first glance, Carlton Straight's stories indeed appear to be local colour narratives that aim to consolidate Irish national character, as well as to promote understanding between the Irish regions and the imperial centre, England. The preface of his 1836 edition of Traits and Stories of the Irish Peasantry imagines an English readership whose bias towards the Irish rural population the stories seek to overcome. Carlton evokes regional differences in England between the people of Yorkshire and the natives of Somerset that his readers may be familiar with, as an introduction to the communities of the Northern Irish that he portrays in his tales. Moreover, the author claims that the desire is neither to distort his countrymen into demons, nor to enshrine them as suffering innocents and saints, but to exhibit them as they really are, warm-hearted, hot-headed, affectionate creatures. Carlton's stories, however, also found audiences outside the English-speaking world. I think we are all very much aware of that, because the stories also reach audiences in continental Europe. The collection was translated into many languages, including Dutch, Italian, German, French and Danish. It was published as Skizzen und Erzählungen aus dem Leben des irischen Landvolks by Harry Roberts and issued in 3 volumes by Leipzig publisher Weber in 1837. And in 1861, the entire collection was translated into French by Léon de Wailly as Roman Irlandais, Scènes de la vie champêtre, and published in Paris by A. Dantu. 2 years later, a Danish translation by L. Moltke, entitled Terugkerskildringer of the Ierske Volkelief, was published by Copenhagen publisher Gieklen-Dalske. And as such, Carlton's representations of Vindramore village life in The Hedge School, it's one of his stories, and of the cottier's life in Larry McFarlane's wake, were accessible to audiences across Europe. And I think it's also legitimate to ask the questions, why were these stories translated, right? What was the attraction for many people outside in other parts of Europe to hear stories about localised communities in Ireland? Now, Carlton's stories are by no means the only Irish local core narratives that reach non-English speaking readers on the continent. In fact, during the 1820s and the 1830s, several novels and stories set in a specific rural region of Ireland and relating of the life of the peasantry were translated into other languages, most notably German and French. Regina Maria Roche's The Munster Cottage Boy from 1820 contains regional elements in that the rural characters in her narrative speak in the local dialect, and in that her travelling heroine, Fidelia, in various parts of Ireland visits the cabins of the often poverty-stricken farmers, who often, as we can read, sick and helpless, shivering over the embers of a few turfs which had just sufficed to boil a small pot of potatoes, live in squalor as a result of their absenteeist landlords. Roche's novel was translated into French twice in 1821 by Louis Girard de Calembert as L'Enfant de la Chaumière de Münster, published by Locard et Davy, and by Jean Cohen as L'Orphelin de la Chaumière Irlandaise, published again by Dantu, the publisher I mentioned before. Emily Lawler's novel of life in the burring called Harish, maybe a text you've also heard about, it was published in 1886, was translated into other languages as well, and most notably in Dutch by a woman called Anna Bock. And the Dutch title is Harish, an Ierse roman. And actually it was 4 years later, in 1890, that it was published by a publisher in Gouda, which is a city in basically the southwest of the Netherlands called Quint. And there will undoubtedly be many more examples of European translations and republications. And my future research could map out how these Irish regional narratives travelled through Europe, and additionally how these translated texts were received in the foreign press. And questions I want to ask is also, why were these texts chosen to be translated? What was their appeal? Because local colour fiction was a genre that was popular throughout Europe, so there must have been a reason why these Irish stories had certain elements that made them so attractive to readers abroad. And also which publishers actually published them, right? I already mentioned the name of Dantu as a sort of recurring name, publishing Irish local colour fiction in France. So I think that's a fascinating thing to trace and to get to know more about. If we do all this research, this would probably explain the transnational appeal of Irish local colour fiction more extensively, apart from the fact that local colour fiction was a genre that enjoyed huge popularity in and outside Europe under different names, such as the French roman champêtre, the Spanish novela costumbrista, the Scandinavian provincial novel, the Italian verismo, and the German Dorfgeschichte. As a result, there was a market for translating popular local colour fiction into other languages. And thus, if we look at texts from the outside, we also have a French text by Alphonse Daudet, Lettres de Montmoulin, from 1869. It was translated into English in 1888. It was also reaching Irish readers. And we have a German text by Bertolt Auerbach called Schwarzwälder Dorfgeschichte, basically village stories of the Black Forest, if I were translated. That was actually published in 1834 and translated into English in 1847. So what we are aware of is that local colour fiction is a genre with transnational appeal and dissemination. And Irish local colour fiction is definitely no exception to this rule. European local colour fiction was also reprinted across the Atlantic, and it is especially true for Irish local colour fiction, which appeared in specific editions for the North American market, or which was reprinted in periodicals catering for Irish North American immigrant communities. And then you can think of journals like The Pilot, The Emerald, or The Irish American. Especially during the 1880s and 1890s, Irish local colour fiction was reissued for the US and Canadian markets. Archibald McIlroy's Killyard-like stories on the County Antrim peasantry from Scottish descent in The Old Meeting House Green were originally published in Belfast by McCall, Stevenson and Orr in 1898. And 1 year later it was published actually in Toronto by F.H. Revell. If we look again at Sean Bullock's text that I referred to before, Ring of Rushes, it was reissued in American and Australian editions by Melbourne and New York publishers Wardlock & Co. and by Chicago publishers Stone & Kimball, all in the same year, 1896. Catherine Tinnan dedicated her Isle in the Water, published in 1895, to Jane Barlow, a collection of stories set on a not specifically defined island on Ireland's western coast. The volume was launched on the American market by Macmillan & Co. in New York. And Jane Barlow's Irish Idylls from 1892 and her Strangers in Liscannor from 1895, which is often seen as the second part of Irish Idylls, were highly successful on the US market, published in New York by Dodd, Mead & Co. in 1893 and 1895 respectively, and appearing in further reprint. 6 of the stories collected in Eccles Aliens of the West, that I referred to at the beginning of my talk, were even first published in the Catholic American Ecclesiastical Review and the Pall Mall magazine, before being printed together in an edition by the London publisher Cushell. So they first had an American audience, and then they were actually they became more accessible to an Irish/British audience afterwards. This publication data not only testify to the intensive transnational literary infrastructures that existed between Ireland and countries in which many Irish immigrants settled, and that have remained rather under-researched up till now. They also underscore that one can only do justice to Irish local colour fiction by studying it exactly in light of those transnational dimensions, and the function it may have had in the concretion of diasporic identities, as well as the establishment of transcultural ties between homeland and immigrant communities. That this is a significant issue becomes also clear from prefaces to North American editions of Irish local colour narratives, and I'm going to show you that right now. Seamus McManus' Through the Stuff Smoke, a collection of tales about life in rural Donegal, published for the American market by Doubleday and McClure in 1899, emphasizes the author's origins in the region, even while he's residing in New York at the time of publication. McManus talks about my remote and mountain-barred Donegal and connects his tales to the Shanachi tradition, as he states. From early childhood, with my little tribute of admiration, he sat by the Shanachi's feet, hoping one day to be faring forth and conquering worlds for myself. So, modelling himself upon the teller of tales and the singer of songs he listened to as a child, McManus evokes a direct connection between his Donegal stories and the oral traditions of the region, by creating an atmosphere of local authenticity. Furthermore, by invoking the image of a crowd of listeners gathered around the turf fire, old and young, boys and girls, for the wand of wit is laid upon them and they forget their cares. The preface almost transplants American readers, even those unfamiliar with Donegal rural existence, into this setting of traditional oral transmission, immersing them into a regional cultural community that's geographically remote through an authentic replication of storytelling. And as such, McManus's tales are rooted in what Donovan calls the conventional double vision of local colour narratives, which suggest a narrator who was once or is an insider to the region, but can also mediate its customs, ways of life and traditions to outsiders, because he or she has also moved outside of that region. Now, the prefatory material to the American 1898 edition of Jane Barlow's Irish Idylls, the wild Bocklands of Connaught, which are actually central to it, clearly situates the narrative into a context of American reception. The readership that Barlow singles out in her preface are, as she says, American readers to whose shores the wild Bocklands of Connaught send so many a forlorn voyager over oceans of sea. They will perhaps care to glance at his old home and learn the reasons why he leaves it, which seem to lie very obviously on the surface, and the reasons less immediately apparent why his neighbours bide behind. She thus imagines and almost stages a general American audience whose understanding of their Irish immigrant fellow citizens can be improved by showing them where these new Americans come from. Another example, another preface to this 1898 edition of the story collection is actually written by a Massachusetts photographer, Clifton Johnston. And this preface also resonates explicitly with the mediation of the region to a transatlantic audience. Johnson talks about the photographs he has contributed to the publication, which, as he says, are the result of a trip made to the Connemara Bocklands of Western Ireland for the express purpose of securing material that should be absolutely true to the description in the text. Ironically, by resorting to a modern medium to render traditions faithfully, in photography, the collection is thus marketed as a true product of Connemara rural existence and its customs. It is a slice of authenticity to which American readers have access, as the narrative, as Barlow herself implies in the preface, is one emigrant more crossing the Atlantic. The preface to Sean Bullock's Rings of Rashes, both in the Belfast and the New York edition, I should say, also mediates between outsiders to the region and the regional ways of existence he portrays. borrowing heavily from discourses of tourism and the process. The author takes the reader by the hand and traverses the landscape with him or her, as if guiding a foreign traveller through familiar haunts. You can actually read, if you enter Lishmany town by way of the ferry road, you pass the church standing high beyond the graveyard wall among its yews and tombstones. Then have a glimpse of the massive walls and shining windows of the poor house, the very walls which once heard the ramblings of Debbie Chance, and below which Solomon Gray used to take his weekly turn at the pump wheel. Presently come to a filthy, ill-conditioned alleys through which you pass, and you once strike Lismahy in its very vitals. But if you want to see Glogeen in its glory, walk through its surging streets on fair or market day. Well, this description also brings the scene to life to readers across Ireland and Britain, unfamiliar with County Fermanagh. The preface specifically appears to reach out to diasporic audiences. It references mournful emigrants leaving their Ulster homes, a scene transatlantic readers could identify with. You can actually read, how many that one knew, sons and daughters of the Rings of Rushes, have sobbed goodbye to every field and there, as homesick and heartbroken, they passed them for the last time. The discourses of tourism that Bullock employs also serve as in Alice Nolan's text called The Burns of Glengula. It's actually a very interesting text. It also deals with the Irish famine. And it's written by what is believed to be an Irish-American immigrant. And it's actually initially serialized in the widely read nationalist Irish Citizen between 22nd of February and the 5th of September 1868, before being issued in book form by New York publisher O'Shea. Now, in this text, preface sets out to voice the aim of the text, which is to acquaint second generations of Irish Americans who, I quote, never saw the old historic land of their fathers with the beautiful county of Wicklow in Ireland. What follows in the novel itself is an address to the reader, admonishing him or her to visit the county, and a lengthy description of the specific scenery of the setting of the novel, so that the travelling readers can be guided through the region. We can actually read, emerging from those lovely shades, it makes a curve by the loud house of Arklow, and with a joyous bound flings itself into the arms of the Irish Sea or St. George's Channel, which forms the eastern boundary of Ireland. So you get this very detailed geographical description in the text. As an example of a narrative which was produced outside Ireland, the island of Ireland, but which engages with Irish regional customs and traditions, Nolan's narrative shows that if we talk about local colour fictions as a genre, it is much more complex than often envisaged, since it's often written at a geographical distance from, or actually where the area is actually set, where the narrative is set, and also is reconstructed by this narrative from the outside. So I think we have to be really aware of these issues. Now, if I come to a conclusion to some of the things I've been presenting to you today, what can we say? Well, traditionally, the local colour tale could be seen as a monument to regional traditions and ways of life that enshrines them in the face of imperialism and nationalism. When we look, for instance, at the story of George Moore and other texts, it suggests that the region is what Anne Rigney would call a portable monument. The region becomes a mental construct that can be translocated across the Atlantic, albeit in the form of a crystallized memory. As such, it corresponds to the representations of the local by Bullock and Moore, which suggest permanence and little openness to change. Other writers envisage the Irish region as a more flexible space that is inextricably connected with and changed by its transnational connections. This paper has aimed to outline future directions of research for local colour narratives, and even local colour in general. What is needed is a shift in paradigms in both regional studies as well as Irish studies that involves the perception of the 19th and early 20th century region, not as an extension of the nation or nationalism, but as a representation or figure of memory even, is constructed in transnational dynamics. A reconsideration of local colour fiction in view of its transnational themes addresses readerships and reception, which will imply massive data collection and even a digital mapping out of networks and infrastructures. This is also what I plan to do if I have the chance to get to do this really important project, is in my view the road to take. While the revival of the region today is often attributed to negotiations of globalization and a response to, basically you could say, a big fear of immigration, multiculturalism and globalization, It may prove that texts from the past can shed completely new light on similar processes of community and identity formation more than a century ago. Thank you very much.